And I am Johnny Detroit. This is pregame.com. I am with Chuck Edel. And what we're going to do is we're going to break down Major League Baseball and give you some baseball betting tips real quick on who Chuck is. If you're unfamiliar, he's 25 years of experience as a sports handicapper and bettor. He lives in Las Vegas, actually bets his stuff. He has a private client list that he gives the plays via text message. He does some stuff and co-hosts over at Sports X Radio and is a regular guest on several local and national radio shows. He's regularly featured in the Las Vegas Review-Journal's Hot Corner, and he had a 27-12-1 record and is the highest winning percentage of any guest handicapper that's ever participated. He won the 2011 Las Vegas Review-Journal's College Football Shootout, hitting 58.4% wins, and he finished in the money in the Leroy's College Basketball Contest multiple times. Chuck, before we continue, is there anything that I am leaving out?
You covered the bases. I off the top of my head, you did a pretty good job there.
Okay. Well, let's get to the nitty-gritty. What I'm going to do is there's some questions that's already set up. I want to go to you, and then I'm going to let you give some tips. Take as long or as little as you feel that you're going to need. The first one is more, this is my own personal question. You being in Vegas, someone who bets for a living, I remember back in the day, I'm like 38, when the offshore stuff, when you had your pinnacles and, everything you could even deposit via PayPal. I remember sitting at home and I had a program built by a Russian, and you would be able to like scalp games at will. It seemed like a lot of these places, they weren't moving on air. Bookmakers were trying to be bookmakers. And I was just literally $10 here, $30 here, $40 here. And the math in my head was, as long as even if I was doing $100 a day, that's making me an extra $36.5 a year. And that's more than a lot of people's 401ks would do. And today, I have sports options. I have a lot of credit shops. And is it just me, or is it like almost impossible unless you got a place that's giving you sharp lines and another place giving you totally public lines, or an old school phone guy, that scalping baseball is almost like a thing of the past? And, people who are betting nowadays that weren't part of that era would probably have no idea on how easy that was at that point in time.
There's still people out there who do it. I mean, there's two ways you could do it now. Number one is, if you get a good number either late overnight or early in the morning, and you anticipate the line move. That's one way of doing it. Obviously, you got to, there's still some places out there 5% juice. I mean, that's obviously if you get a 5-cent line, which is not easy to do, but there is, but it is a grind, and it's harder than ever to do it. I agree with you there. I think the guys who do it now maybe are guys who jump in on a number before it moves and then take the best of it on the other side.
Yeah, and to be honest, back in the day, I was one who I took the free ones. You would literally see some square shop like a Wager Street or a Sports Interaction. I'd bet it, go take a piss, have a drink, then go to Pinnacle, bet the other side. And there was no rushing. There was no having to take leans. So let's get to the nitty gritty, Chuck. And baseball, I mean, you do good at a lot of different sports, but, there's not a lot of guys that I've met. And baseball to me is one of the more complex things in terms of gambling. There's so many different aspects. And we were talking before we started, talking about, my Detroit Tigers and the fact that, they could have every piece of the puzzle, but without that relief, they can't win the game. So I'm going to go over a couple of main topics, and feel free to jump in. If you want to move on, we can move on. The first one I want to talk about is run lines. And, for me, I'm always somebody who, unless there's a reason, I try not to take home teams on the run line, for obvious reasons, for that, not getting that extra at bat up by one. And, statistically, when a road favorite, they cover when they win, they'll cover the run line about 44% of the time. A home team about 39%, the obvious bottom of the ninth batting. And when they win and win by one run, it happens 12% to the road team and 18% of the home. Once again, you're up 3-2, you're the home team, you don't bat. Is there any tips or advice or anything that you look for? I've heard guys say They like taking the +1.5 on the low totals or the -1.5 on the big totals. Looking at division games, run lines. What's your thoughts on betting run lines and any tips and tricks you could share with our audience?
I don't do a lot of it, but once in a while there is a situation. I mean, there is, and what you said. I mean, there is a rhyme, a reason behind the, for the short total. You're looking at a six. Just for example, Phillies Atlanta playing tonight. The total 6.5. I mean, there's a good chance, people, that game could be a one-run game. So there is guys out there looking to take the plus run half, but on a game like tonight, you got to lay 210. So not something I do. What I have done in the past, and I still will do once in a while, back in the day when Colorado would have the 14-run totals and stuff. I mean, if you get a high total, like the wind's blowing out at Wrigley Field, for example, and you happen to like the Cubs that day, let's say they're the favorite. I mean, I think sometimes there is value because there's a greater chance of a game when the total's 12.5 or 13 with a lot of runs expected to be scored, that team might win by more than a run and a half. So certain situations will dictate if I do that, but it's not something I make a habit of.
Speaking of weather, and I had a guy a couple years ago that had me. He was an agent for 5 Dimes, and he asked me to look at some guys he had that were just destroying him in baseball totals, and it was weird. And I was trying everything I could to figure it out, and I kind of had a sense they were doing something with weather because I was looking at where the teams were located, and it just seemed like over under based off where they were, and they rotate in and out. And finally I told him, I said, look, just go to the guys and say, I paid you enough. I'm not going to be I think about it, but I could probably find you some outs. Let's work something out together and figure out what they're doing. And it came out that these guys were essentially just weather nerds, and they knew everything from the wind velocity, air density, air pressure, and and it correlated into the pitching, the hitting, the length of time that a ball would drop, and they were just destroying this guy in totals. I'm no weather expert by any means. When you do your handicapping, and you mentioned, on the run lines, maybe sometimes you will take that home team minus the 1.5 if the wind's blowing out and they're the big favorite, that you feel you could overcome that hump, that if it's a close game that you might not have that bat in the bottom of the ninth with the lead. Is there any factoring of weather that you do? And if maybe not, is there anything or good stories you've heard of other people that have that you could share?
I factor weather. There's a few times that, I mean, early on in the season, you got to factor in the cold weather. It's a fact that the ball, when it's hot and humid, the ball travels farther. I mean, I'm not a weather guy like you're saying, but I have surrounded myself by people or talked to people. And, when you get, last summer, for example, there was games, I remember specifically Ben Overs in the New York Yankee games. They had a streak where it was like 100 degrees, like 5 or 6 days in a row, hot and humid. They couldn't make the totals high enough. Every day during that streak, they kind of figured out what was going on. They kept on making the totals higher. The ball was flying out of there. So, yeah, I mean, that's definitely a thing to look at. When you get that hot, humid weather, the ball definitely carries better. That's something you want to look at. And the West Coaster, when you're looking at Dodger games, Padre games, day games, the ball, it's just the fact the ball carries better during the day, for example, in Dodger Stadium than at night. At night, you forget about it. You hit the hell out of the ball, and, it's tough to get it out of there. During the day, you hit the ball the same way, it's out of there. So you definitely want to, know all this stuff when you're, looking at the totals.
One of the things that I think in baseball, and it's just funny, is sometimes I'll have like locals or whatever will call me for advice. Is this guy sharp, or what are they doing? And a guy asked me to audit his stuff, and I said the first thing you needed to do, I go, you need to call whoever you're putting your guys through and tell them to change it to a 20-cent line. I said anybody who calls and says they want a dime is someone you should be concerned about. And he goes, what do you mean? He goes, I didn't even notice that, which is funny. It's like everyone's a cookie bookie nowadays. You call these head count places, and all of a sudden you're a bookie. And I'm like, well, I go, your average bettor doesn't understand the importance of a dime line. And even the people that think they're smart and they say, I'm playing somewhere at a dime shop, it's like, well, really, you kind of are, but you're not, because, when they graduate into the 20-cent line, a place might start off at a dime line so they could advertise that. But once you get past 120, all of a sudden they're giving you a 20-cent line and you have no clue. Do you think that in baseball, how much emphasis or importance do you think someone who's betting baseball should be on line shopping or making sure that you're placing bets with places that are either dealing a dime line, and the ones that are dealing the dime lines find the ones that have the graduation up a higher level before they bump to the 20? Do you think that's something that has tons of value, or do you think I'm overestimating or over putting too much emphasis on that?
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. And this is funny, Johnny. Honestly, I had this conversation this afternoon with somebody because, and the people out there listening, I mean, some of these, books, they're going to throw 20-cent lines at you. And, I would never bet based, if you're betting size, of course, totals. But if you're betting size, then they're going to throw a 20-cent line at you, meaning the team's minus 150. Instead of the take back being 40, they're going to only give you 30. It makes it a lot harder. You got to win that much more. I would never play at anybody using a 20-cent line. If somebody's out there listening and they're getting a 20-cent line dealt to them, tell your book that, hey, I want to play, but I'm not going to play with a 20-cent line. And you'd be surprised. They might all of a sudden the next day you might have a 10-cent line. So I don't think you're overreacting at all. I mean, why? Here's the thing: you could still make money at 20%. It's a lot harder to, but why? Why should you? I mean, there's definitely outs there that you want to be able to get the 10-cent line if at all possible.
Yeah, and I don't want to end up in the trunk of a car, but to be honest, one of the things I do know is if you are playing through a local on one of these credit places, almost anything can be edited. Parlay odds, teaser odds, types of bets, limits, dime lines, how far it goes up to, what you're paying for half a points. So you know what? The squeaky wheel gets the oil, and the worst they could do is say no. So my advice is take a look, see if you're playing that dime or that 20-cent line, and you know what? There's a lot of fish in the sea now, so many head count places, and I'm sure they're going to do what they can to keep your business. One of the things, Chuck, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned umpires, and that is one of the things I've tried in myself, understanding the run lines, and I've done stuff with Dr. Ed Meyer where I've in the past, way before pregame even, I actually paid him some money to run some simulations on some stuff I wanted to look at in divisional games. So I've looked at run lines, I've looked at the weather. I understand the whole thing of graduated lines, but one thing that I've never been able to really, I guess, grasp or take the time to learn, and when we spoke prior to setting this up, you brought it up, is umpires. How important are umpires? What are some things you look for? And what are some good places to get some good umpire data that you'd recommend?
You could Google. There's a lot of places. Just tell RJ to put it up, and you guys could put it up on the site. I mean, it's a great thing to look at. But there's a lot of places, and here's the thing with umpires, and here's where you don't want to get caught up just making plays just because the umpire is an over or he's an under guy. But there's a couple things that, what I try to do myself before I look at the umpires, I try to have everything done, and then I look at the umpires. So if you like the over and it's an over umpire, that might push you stronger on it, or vice versa. And there's also, you got to know what the pitchers are. I always use the Tommy Glavine, guy, a guy who always, if you get that guy with an under umpire when Tom Glavine in the day was pitching, if you get a guy, because that guy could throw the ball 2 inches outside and 2 inches inside at will, you get an umpire who's going to give him strikes when he does that, an under umpire, not only for the total but for the side. That's a huge edge. But you also get Tom Glavine pitching a guy who's not going to give you those corners. Now it's a huge edge. You might get a good price at the dog, because if he's not going to give him, now all of a sudden it takes away from his game a little bit. Most umpires are going to half of them are going to be pretty fair about using the corners, but a guy like that now who's not going to give Tom Glavine the corners, he's going to probably get hit that day, and that so you can use it for the sides too, not only as well as the totals, but they're definitely out there. Paul Emmel last year, Johnny, was 26-5-2, 26 overs, only 5 unders. He had 2 pushes. He actually umpired the game the other night. Dodgers San Francisco was a 3-0 final. So you want to every year they change. Sometimes an over umpire could all of a sudden be an under guy. But last year, 26-5-2. Now he was one guy I blindly was following there for a while, because just at one time he was like 13-1 or something crazy.
Sabermetrics, and we don't need to go into it if it's not something you're a fan of or follow. What are your thoughts on the whole sabermetrics thing in relationship to handicapping and using in betting baseball?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, they're out there. I mean, I think you have to use them. I mean, without getting too in depth about everything. I mean, it's now the line. For a while there, the line makers weren't. We were able to catch them off a little bit. Now, a lot of the line makers, a lot of people are using some of the sabermetrics, but there's still some good value on some of the sabermetric stuff. I mean, there's guys. I'll try without getting too complex. I'll give you an example. Let's say. The batting average, of a pitcher, batting average of balls in play. So obviously it doesn't count strikeouts or home runs, only the balls in play. Sometimes the guy might have. Let me use a better example, maybe easier. A home run percentage of fly balls. So that's one of the sabermetric things. How many of a pitcher gives up fly balls? How many of those fly balls are home runs? And sometimes you might find a pitcher with a real high percentage of those, higher than the average going out, but over the guy's last 5 years, he was way lower, for example, and you also know that he's healthy and he hasn't lost any velocity in his fastball. So it was probably a fluke. Maybe he was pitching in Wrigley Field with the wind blowing out. Maybe he was in Colorado. Maybe he was one of those, especially early on in the season, because the stats could be, really swayed a little bit. I want to touch on that real quick too after I talk about this, Johnny, about the early in the season stats, but. So sometimes you would look at that and know more than likely it's the percentages of that happening are going to kind of come back a little bit. So sometimes you could have some value on a pitcher, and the same thing works for a team hitting and stuff. They could be hitting a lot of line drives and just having bad luck with outs. So I don't know if that all makes sense or not, but
it does, and that's one of the things that I always wondered about sabermetrics is the fact of it just being so much math. But baseball, it's not football where it's 100-yard field. Everything is the same. I mean, like you said, there's, different umpires. There's, as we spoke earlier, weather conditions. Say a batter, exact same pitch, exact same swing, exact same contact in Comerica Park versus Yankee Stadium. That ball might get caught in center field in Comerica and end up at the parking lot at Yankee Stadium. I mean, there's so many variables that I'm always curious that, how much value or do people, in my opinion, I guess, may put too much value on the sabermetrics because there are so many variables that aren't constant. For me, I guess if it was football where, it's 100 yards, the rules are almost always called pretty much the same. There's no room for error. I mean, it's a face mask. Is a face mask. You don't have umpires calling wider strike zones. You don't have different size parks. You don't have places, in Denver for elevation for football is not the same, in my opinion, of a baseball game with a ball where there's pitching and batting and running and everything else where how far that baseball is going to go. So do you think maybe, I don't want to say to not use sabermetrics, but do you think because of like the last couple of years, it just seems like the Moneyball movie and people on the internet, that there's just too much emphasis being put on sabermetrics?
Yeah, I think there is guys out there who might, you got to everything. You got to put that in the equation. You can't just depend solely on that. There's a lot of variables, but yeah, it definitely should be put in the equation. And like you said, football not only the difference, but football they play 16 games, baseball 162, so
right.
A much bigger sample size. You're going to get a much truer, stat in baseball after 80 games, because a much bigger sample size. But yes, I know what you're saying. There is guys out there I think get too zoned in on these stats, and they find a pitcher, and I remember there was some sabermetrics guys, and now they're not trying to beat him anymore. Johnny Cueto for a while was not a good sabermetrics pitcher, and for 2 years they were trying to beat him, and finally he kind of they stopped going against him. But that's just I guess a good example of a pitcher who a lot of the sabermetrics guys didn't like for a while, who's been extremely successful.
Here's one more question for me, and then I'm going to let you go into anything you want to talk about, Chuck, and I don't want to keep you longer than, just to keep you. Even though I love bullshitting with you.
We're good. However, yeah.
People, you always hear the martingale-based stuff, and I'm not a fan of the pressing, because you're eventually going to go ruin at one point or another. But in baseball, are there instances that, because I know the square thing is there's no way the Tigers will lose 3 at home. Verlander's pitching. You always hear that there's the no way thing. And usually if there's the no way thing is when it happens and then somebody goes busto. But is there situations, trends, certain things that you look for in a series that you would double up? And I've had some people that I kind of respect, and that they will have certain times in the year, or situations, or certain players, or whatever it may be, that they'll double up on a team in a series for whatever reason. And in other sports, very rarely do you ever hear anyone ever say double or triple up on something. Unless you're counting cards or whatnot. But is there any time in baseball that you are comfortable, I guess, pressing that you on a team in a series?
No, I mean, I'll tell you the ones that, I know some people who entered in the equation. It's if a home team, being at home, is going to get swept, the last home game, there, you look to take that home team. If let's say it's a 3-game series, Cleveland and Toronto. Cleveland won the first 2 games. This is the 3rd game. They'll look to take Toronto. I know, personally, I don't do that. I mean, I might know about it in the back of my head. I don't think it sways me, but I'm not one of those guys. But there is guys out there who, that's one that I'm familiar with, that some guys I respect do throw that in the equation.
So baseball season's here. Is there anything that surprised you so far this year?
Not really. I mean, obviously it's kind of early on. I mean, I will say, I said this on the radio there a few different times, that, and we'll see, it's plenty early in the season, but I did say I think Toronto this year is going to be last year's LA Angels, meaning they got a lot of new faces, they got a lot of pub, they got all these guys, but it might take them a while to kind of put it together. And I thought the lines were going to be pretty high on Toronto, especially here in the beginning of the season, because it's been well publicized by the media, and any fan who looks at their roster, you can see they've made some improvements. But so maybe you look to take advantage of that. And they start off the season 0-2, so maybe that's something to look at. But I guess I was surprised that Oakland lost the first 2 games to Seattle. I guess that was a surprise. I lost myself. I was on Oakland on one of those games and lost, but. And the Cubs won a couple games. That's always surprising, isn't it?
I didn't expect to be going to opening day tomorrow and have my Tigers 1-2 after playing the Twins. So trust me, I know where you're coming from. So we just went over tons of shit. I mean, run lines, weather, pressing, umpires, sabermetrics. I always have to say is I think baseball is one of the most unappreciated sports to handicap, because there's just so much information and just so many things from the starter. It's like, I guess you could say, if halfway through the 3rd quarter, Peyton Manning went to the bench and the backup came in, it's like baseball is so many different things change. The lineups change. One day you don't have different, unless someone's hurt. One day you'll go to the game and Cabrera, they're resting him for 3 days. Someone else is playing first. There are different guys in the outfield. I mean, the variables alone to keep up with, to me, are, a full-time job to handicap. So we got about 7 minutes left. What are some things that when you break down, say, the daily card, and, and I'm not expecting you to give away all your secrets or anything, but some stuff you're comfortable sharing, some things that you like to look at, some things that maybe you keep notes on, whatever it may be. Like, break me down through your beginner Chuck Edel day on breaking down baseball. So say tomorrow you wake up, you're going to bet your baseball. What are some things you could share with us that you'd be doing?
Okay. Let me share one thing that I do early on in the season, and I'll get to a couple things I look at, but I just wanted to throw this out because it is early in the season, so people can take advantage of this. And I'm going to use A.J. Burnett as the example, because I made a ton of money betting on A.J. Burnett last year. Early on in the season, it only takes one bad game and to get your ERA up there, and it takes a while to get that ERA back. A.J. Burnett last year, Johnny, at the beginning of the year, I want to say it was like the 2nd game of the season. Don't quote me on it, but it was early on in the season. He had one bad outing. It was against St. Louis, pitched like 2 1/3 innings, and let up 12 runs. So his ERA looked like horror movie.
Mm-hmm.
But after that, he went like 10, 11 games with giving up maybe 3 runs or less like in every game. But his ERA was still up there. And so many people, I'm just talking about the average fan, the average guy who goes into the sports book to make a bet and looks at your sheet there and sees the guy's ERAs and all that. So I love it when something like that happens, when you get like a good pitcher like that. And now there was so much value on A.J. Burnett, but somehow it didn't get, even in the line, it showed in the line, which I was surprised for a long time before everybody kind of caught on and he was talked about. But we got like 7 or 8 really good value games out of A.J. Burnett, and obviously Pittsburgh was playing well at the same time. But those are things you want to look at early on. Don't just look at these guys' ERAs. It could be just from one bad game. The guy could have 5 good games and 1 bad game. It looks like he's not pitching well. So that's just kind of like a novice thing that I always throw out there. I find a couple of those every year, and being early in the season, those things work well. But another thing I do look at, I mean, I like to look at the lefty-righty, situation. I love to look at, some teams perform, better, because their lineups and it's, the lineups are different, obviously, against lefties and righties, but some teams perform better against lefties than righties, but the line really doesn't show it that much, and that's something, that sometimes that you could take advantage of. I'll give you one example. Last year, San Francisco Giants last year were 94 and 68, good record, right? Against righties, they were 54 and 49. So if you bet them every time against the righty, you're probably down money. Against lefties, they were 40 and 19 last year. So I mean, those are things that and sometimes you're getting the same number as you are, whether they're facing a righty or lefty. So that's something that jumps out at me. That's something I always look at to see how teams perform against righties, lefties, and home and road as well.
Is baseball a sport? I always, and it varies on who I talk to, but it seems like it's one of the more consistent things. Like in college basketball, early in the season, it's easy to beat. By conference play, it's tougher. Is baseball easier to beat later because it's such a statistic-driven sport? Outside of the anomalies, like you said, of a guy's have the 1 bad game, 3 good games, and his ERA is not really showing what he's done, because like you said, he got rocked 1 game. When is baseball easiest to, I guess, bet on? Is it in the beginning when you're taking advantage if you're following the sport, or is it later when you have enough information that you feel your numbers are better than what the odds makers are putting together?
Me personally, I like it early better. In fact, I really don't do a lot after July, I'll be honest. Once it hits August, there's so many variables in August. Teams know they're out of it. Guys bringing up minor leaguers. I mean, there's a lot of different things. So a lot of those stats and all these things that you've been looking at, throw them out the window, because now it's like you're seeing a lot of different players getting mixed in. So, and the reason I do that, Johnny, is because I've lost money after July a lot of years until I figure that out. So I pretty much, unless there's good spots, I bet many. Let's say this: I still bet baseball, but much less games starting August 1st and the beginning of the season. Baseball is one sport different than football. The good teams, the bad teams. Basketball, what's going on. Baseball is a one sport. Any team can come out of nowhere, and sometimes you can find those teams early on and keep on. And it takes a while for those lines to move. I mean, Pittsburgh Pirates. I'll just use that. We were talking about the first half of the season last year, made me a ton of money because they were playing well, and and I rode them there for a while. So that's how I look at it. I know there's some guys who bet baseball, they feel like the lines are softer in September because football is going on. And if you do your homework like that, maybe you're right. But I pretty much dig into football by September.
And what you just said is a great point too. Is I wish I would have wrote these numbers down, but for football, I mean, you got a good team. They go 14-2, 13-3. An astronomical 80%, 90% win rate. Where the Detroit Tigers, they were predicted to win between 92 and 92 and a half games, which means, what does that put them? 15 games, 10 games over 5, whatever it is, over 500. I mean, and that's considered to be, one of the better records, or better in terms of records for the year. And it just shows you, like, even the best teams in baseball lose a shitload of games. I mean, the year that the Tigers won, I remember we couldn't beat the Royals. And the Royals couldn't beat anybody when they could beat the Tigers. So I guess if there's one tip, if I never spoke with you again and I was taking your 401k to bet baseball this year, time flew by, and I just want to say I really appreciate you taking the time to talk bases with me, Chuck. It's just
It's a lot of fun. Anytime.
totally fascinates me. Is I'm taking your 401k, I'm betting baseball this year, and you're allowed to give me one tip that I have to follow no matter what. What's that tip going to be?
But it's tough. I mean, I mean,
give me two if you want. Hey, Chuck, if you want to.
No, I mean, some of the like the top, like the one I said, a basic one, I guess. How teams perform against lefty righties. I mean, I guess that's one that I might follow closer than others. I'm one of those guys who thinks the pitchers are about 5 cents priced high always. Not that I go against good pitchers, but I always think everybody bets pitchers, and I always feel like the line is about 5 cents too much because of the pitcher. That's me. So maybe you got to look at other stuff besides, the pitcher. We know how good a pitcher is or not, maybe, and but that's something. But one thing I'll throw, I guess, maybe look how they do against righties, lefties, a basic thing.
Well, Mr. Chuck Edel, I really appreciate the time it took. Hopefully, we got the balls in motion, and there's a lot more stuff you're going to be doing pregame. When are you going to be on the radio show?
Let's do more of this. This beats having to drive down 35 minutes to the ESPN to do the show. I'm comfortable here in my office.
Right now, we can do this as much as you want. So, all right, Chuck. Pleasure as always. You're the real deal, and it's always a pleasure to talk gambling with you, sir. Take care, and thanks again. And thanks for everyone who listened, and thanks for everyone who's going to be listening to this on the archives. I'm Johnny Detroit. This is pregame.com. He's Chuck Edel. That's going to do it. That's all, folks. Best of luck.